I will never forget the sound of the heart monitor beeping next to my daughter's hospital bed, or the moment my sister, Stephanie, leaned over her unconscious body and said, "Maybe it is better if she does not survive. Her mother is a curse." Those words hit me like physical blows, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. She looked at my 9-year-old Olivia as if she were a line item to be erased from a ledger. I was not just a mother in grief. I was a curse. And the worst part? The family was already nodding along. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Also, please drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. As I sat in that hard, plastic chair at the Chicago Trauma Center, listening to my sister discuss my daughter's death as a logistical convenience, something in me shifted. I did not cry. I did not ask why. I just felt a strange, icy clarity settle over my skin, like the air from the hospital vents. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I was the one who worked 60-hour weeks as a coordinator to ensure our mother, Patricia, had her hip replacement. I was the one who subsidized Stephanie's lifestyle while she was building her real estate empire. But standing here, watching her designer heels click against the sterile floor, I realized our relationship was not a bond, it was a subscription. And I was finally hitting the cancel button. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. My fingers were steady, moving with the precision of someone balancing a spreadsheet. First, I accessed the shared legacy account. This was the $1 million from my late husband money meant to secure the children's future. Money that Stephanie and the rest of the family assumed I was too emotional to manage. They thought I was a liability. They were about to find out I was the sole proprietor. With 3 taps, I revoked Stephanie's secondary access to the trust. I changed the authorization codes, effectively locking her out of the capital she was already counting as her own. Next, I sent an internal message to the hospital's administration office. My mother, Patricia, was watching me from her walker, her eyes filled with a rehearsed pity. She started to say something about being realistic, about how the medical bills would bankrupt us, but I did not let her finish. I stood up, and for the first time in 34 years, I did not look at her as my mother. I looked at her as a defaulting debtor. I told her that I had just updated the emergency contact list. Stephanie was no longer a designated guardian. In fact, if anyone other than me or the medical staff tried to make a decision for Olivia, security would be called. I explained this in a tone that was calm, factual, and lethal. Stephanie's perfect blonde hair seemed to stiffen. She tried to laugh, that sharp, brittle sound that usually made me shrink. She told me I was being dramatic, that the stress had finally broken my brain. She tried to place a manicured hand on my shoulder, a gesture of fake sympathy she used on her high-end real estate clients. I stepped back, avoiding her touch as if it were an infection. I looked her directly in the eye and told her that her access to my life had been liquidated. There would be no more subsidies. No more loans for her Mercedes. No more using my daughter's tragedy as a leverage point for her greed. The rest of the relatives, Aunt Paula and Uncle Jerome, exchanged glances. They were not shocked by what Stephanie had said about the curse. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. They had overdrafted my compassion for years, and now they were facing a frozen account. I looked at the heart monitor, the rhythmic green line, a reminder that my Olivia was still fighting. She did not need a family of vultures. She needed a mother who could count, and I was done with the bad math of our relationship. I turned my back on them and focused on the only thing that had actual value in that room, my daughter's next breath. As the door clicked shut, leaving only the rhythmic wheeze of the ventilator, I looked down at my hands. They were steady now, but they were the hands of a woman who had spent a decade in survival mode. For years, I had lived in what I now realize was a house of mirrors. Every time I looked for my own worth, Stephanie and Patricia were there to distort it, reflecting back a version of me that was small, incompetent, and forever in debt to the family. They called it loyalty. I now call it the invisible chains of the survivor. It is a psychological prison without bars. where the jailers convince you that you are staying of your own free will. I had been the designated scapegoat for 34 years. When Stephanie's real estate ventures faltered, I was the one who adjusted my own grocery budget to cover her temporary shortfalls. When Patricia needed a $70,000 hip replacement, I was the one who took a second job doing night shifts in a warehouse. While Stephanie posted photos from a retreat in Aspen, I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon the old guilt that used to keep me tethered. But there is only a cold, hard balance sheet. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for far too long. I think about the $1 million sitting in that trust. To them, that money is not Olivia's future or Ethan's safety. It is a windfall they believe I do not deserve to touch. They assume that because I was willing to suffer in silence, I was weak. They mistook my resilience for a lack of intelligence. But being a survivor does not mean you are broken. It means you have learned to breathe underwater. I had spent years documenting every loan that was never repaid, every hour of emotional labor I provided while they mocked my tiny apartment and my generic cereal. Stephanie had been so busy performing the role of the successful sister that she forgot I was the one keeping the stage from collapsing. I look at Olivia, her face so pale against the white sheets. Stephanie thinks my daughter is a curse because her survival would mean Grace stays in control of the legacy. To Stephanie, a 9-year-old child is just a barrier to a bank account. That is the trap of normalizing cruelty. When you have lived with vultures long enough, you start to believe that picking at bones is just how everyone eats. But the chains are broken now. I am no longer the silent investor in their lies. I am the owner of the debt, and I am here to collect. The hospital room feels different now. The smell of sterile soap is no longer the scent of my failure, but the scent of a clean slate. I am not just waiting for Olivia to wake up. I am preparing the world she is going to wake up into. A world where she and Ethan will never have to wonder if they are loved based on their potential or their usefulness. They are loved because they are mine. And as for the rest of them, they are about to find out that when a survivor stops carrying the weight of others, she becomes the most dangerous person in the room. I stood in the shadows of the hospital hallway, watching my family convene like a board of directors deciding which assets to liquidize. Stephanie was at the center, her voice hushed but sharp, vibrating with the frantic energy of a market crash. She was not mourning my daughter. She was building a case. She had gathered Aunt Paula and Uncle Jerome, whispering about my instability and how the trauma of the accident had finally caused me to snap. This is the pathology of a fractured family. In a toxic family unit, the group functions like a herd of vultures. They do not see a person in pain. They see a weakness to be exploited. To justify their own greed, they have to turn me into the villain. If they can convince themselves that I am a negligent mother, then stealing my children and their $1 million inheritance is not a crime, it is a rescue mission. They were nodding in unison, a collective delusion fueled by the prospect of a massive payout. Stephanie was already showing them photos on her phone. She pointed out the times I had to leave the kids with our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, because I was working double shifts to keep the lights on. She called it abandonment. She mentioned the macaroni and cheese dinners as evidence of nutritional neglect. I watched as Aunt Paula, the retired principal, adjusted her glasses and sighed about the cycle of poverty I was forcing on my son, Ethan. They were not just talking. They were rehearsing for a courtroom. Then Stephanie dropped the real name, Martin, her lawyer friend. She told them that Martin had already drafted the emergency guardianship papers. They were planning to move on Ethan immediately, claiming that with Olivia in a coma and me losing my grip on reality, the boy needed a stable, high-income environment, Stephanie's house with the pool, Stephanie's designer lifestyle. They discussed my son as if he were a piece of prime real estate that needed a better manager. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but it was not the kind that makes you scream. It was the kind that makes you calculate. I realized that my family's morality was entirely transactional. Their loyalty was a currency that had been devalued to zero. They had spent decades treating me as the scapegoat, the one who carries the blame so they can feel superior. But what they forgot is that the scapegoat sees everything from the edges. I was not just a mother in grief. I was a witness to their fraud. I looked over at Ethan, who was sitting in his corner chair with his old, cracked smartphone. He was not coloring anymore. His gray eyes were fixed on Stephanie with an intensity that would have terrified her if she had bothered to look. She assumed he was just a child, a quiet variable in her equation. She did not realize that in her haste to bury me, she had forgotten about the one person who had been recording every word of her mercy speech. The vultures were circling, but they did not realize the prey was armed. The air in the room was dense with the smell of expensive perfume and cheap motives. Stephanie was mid-sentence, her voice a practiced melody of concern when the sound of a plastic coloring case hitting the floor made everyone jump. My 7-year-old son, Ethan, stood up from his corner chair. He had been my shadow for 3 days, a quiet observer in a room full of loud liars. People always mistook his silence for shyness, but Ethan was not shy. He was forensic. He walked to the center of the semicircle of relatives, his wild hair messy and his gray eyes fixed on Stephanie with a lethal precision. "Aunt Stephanie," he said, his voice cutting through her monologue like a blade. "Should I tell everyone what you did when Mom was asleep?" The color drained from Stephanie's face so fast it looked like a physical erasure. She tried to laugh, telling the room that Ethan was just confused, just a child traumatized by his sister's accident. "I am not confused," Ethan said, and there was a weight in his tone that made the residents and Dr. Harrison freeze. "You went through Mom's purse while she was sleeping. I saw you take pictures of her bank papers and her bills. You told someone named Martin on the phone that you would have everything ready to prove Mom is unfit." The room went silent, save for the mechanical rhythm of Olivia's ventilator. Stephanie's mouth opened and closed, gasping for air she did not deserve. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the battered smartphone I had given him months ago. The screen was a web of cracks, but it held the one thing Stephanie could not buy or bully: the truth. "Mom taught me to stand up for what is right," he said, holding the device up like a shield. "So when you started saying mean things about her, I did what Mom said about documenting important stuff. I recorded you." Dr. Harrison stepped between Stephanie and my son, his protective instinct overriding his professional detachment. "Ma'am, please step back. Let us hear what the child has to say," he commanded. With fingers that were finally beginning to tremble, I took the phone. I hit play. Stephanie's voice filled the clinical space crisp and undeniable. She talked about the $1 million in survivor benefits and the legacy contract. She spoke about the plane crash that killed my late husband last month, a massive life insurance settlement she had hidden from me, hoping I'd sign over guardianship before I ever learned the true value of his estate. She called me incompetent. She called me a curse. She laid out her plan to take my children as if they were dividends in a hostile takeover. The relatives backed away from her as if her greed were contagious. I looked at the grainy screen of that old phone and then at my son. He was not just a 7-year-old in a hospital chair anymore. He was the smallest soldier in a war he had not asked for, and he had just fired the shot that would end Stephanie's empire. This was not just family drama anymore, it was evidence. The air in the room did not just feel sterile. It felt final. While Stephanie was still struggling to explain away the recordings, my lawyer, Julia, walked into the intensive care unit with a folder that contained the real kill shot. This was not just about a $1 million inheritance anymore. This was about the fact that my sister was not just a vulture, she was the architect of the crash. Julia did not raise her voice. She simply handed the forensic phone logs to Dr. Harrison and the relatives. 14 calls. My sister had called my cell phone 14 times in the 20 minutes leading up to the accident. She knew I was driving Olivia and the other children on their class trip. She knew I had to be focused on the road. But she did not care about safety. She cared about the legacy contract I had not signed yet. She had been screaming into my voicemail, berating me about family obligations and demanding I release the funds for her failing real estate business. It was that constant, aggressive vibration on the dashboard, that 14th persistent call, that caused the split-second distraction. That was the moment the pickup truck ran the red light and hit the passenger side where my daughter was sitting. Stephanie's greed did not just have a price tag, it had a body count. As the realization hit the room, the relatives backed away from her as if she were a crime scene. Even our mother, Patricia, looked at her eldest daughter with a horror that no designer heels could fix. Stephanie was not the savior she pretended to be in her social media posts. She was the reason my daughter's brain was swelling against her skull. The mercy she had been preaching about the suggestion that we should let Olivia go was not kindness. It was a cover-up. If Olivia never woke up, she could never tell the truth about what she heard on the car's speakerphone that day. But my sister made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the silence of my son. She thought a 7-year-old would not understand the math of her betrayal. Then, the final self-destruction happened. In a fit of unhinged rage, Stephanie lunged for the phone logs, screaming that she deserved that money after years of dealing with my mediocrity. She shrieked that $1 million was a small price to pay for the life she had sacrificed to keep this family looking perfect. She admitted it all on camera. The hospital's security feed and Julia's recording device captured every syllable of her confession. She had signed her own professional and legal death warrant in under 60 seconds. I did not feel a surge of anger. I just looked at the heart monitor and felt a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and the quiet end of her era. The surgery lasted 6 long, hollow hours. I sat in the waiting room with Ethan's small, warm hand in mine, listening to the heavy silence of a family that had finally been silenced by the truth. The other relatives, Aunt Paula, Uncle Jerome, and Cousin Vera, had scattered like ash in the wind, too ashamed to meet the steady gaze of the 7-year-old boy who had exposed their collective rot. My mother, Patricia, had retreated to the hospital chapel, her shoulders shaking with a guilt she would have to carry for the rest of her life. I did not go to her. My compassion was no longer a resource available for her to overdraft. 2 days later, the miracle happened. Olivia opened her eyes. Her first word was, "Mom," weak and raspy, but it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my 34 years. Her second word was Ethan. My son climbed carefully onto her bed, mindful of all the tubes and wires, and as she whispered that he was her hero, I realized that my children were made of a substance Stephanie could never understand. They were resilient. They were the only real family I had ever had. Justice, when it finally arrived, was methodical and absolute. Stephanie was charged with multiple felonies, including fraud and attempted custody interference. The subsequent investigation into her real estate business revealed a systemic pattern of theft from elderly clients, hiding assets to pad her own lifestyle. She lost her real estate license, her white Mercedes, and the magazine-worthy house she had prioritized over her niece's heartbeat. She looked smaller in court, her perfect facade cracked beyond repair, a queen of a hollow empire. But as I sat in the lawyer's office weeks later, I realized that true justice is not found in the destruction of others. I began to understand the justice of the seed sower. This philosophy teaches that the most powerful form of retaliation is not a fire that burns everything down, but the act of planting something beautiful in the clearing. I had $1 million now, the combined life insurance, and the settlement from the aircraft company. Stephanie had expected me to be a worthless burden who would blow through the money in a year. Instead, I chose to cultivate a future she could not touch. I did not buy a designer wardrobe or a mansion. Instead, I established the Olivia and Ethan Legacy Fund, a foundation dedicated to providing legal defense and emergency financial support for single mothers facing predatory litigation from toxic family members. I wanted to ensure that no other woman would ever have to sit at a bedside and listen to a herd of vultures plot to steal her children while her heart was breaking. This was my accounting turning their greed into a resource for those they once considered weak. 6 months later, I watched Olivia run onto a soccer field, her turquoise jersey bright under the Chicago sun. She moved a little slower and tired more quickly, but she was there, refusing to sit on the sidelines of a life she had fought so hard to keep. Ethan sat next to me on the bleachers, still observant, still the smallest soldier, but his gray eyes were full of peace instead of secrets. He had taught me that integrity is the only inheritance that actually matters. Stephanie tried to bury us. She tried to use our grief as a shovel and our temporary poverty as a grave. But she made a fundamental mistake in her calculations. She did not realize that we were not just victims. We were seeds. And when you try to bury a seed, you only give it the environment it needs to grow. My sister is now a footnote in a story about survival, while my children are the headline. I tucked them into their beds in our new, modest, 3-bedroom home that night, knowing they were safe, whole, and loved beyond measure. The debt was settled. The ledger was balanced. I had finally learned that family is not about blood or houses or designer heels. It is about showing up and telling the truth, even when your voice shakes. Somewhere, maybe, their father knew that his children had become everything he had hoped they would be, strong like their mother and brave enough to stand in the light. If you believe that the smallest voices can speak the loudest truths, please share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your support allows us to continue celebrating courage and the unbreakable bonds of real family. Do not forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new journey into justice. Until next time, keep planting seeds of truth in a world of lies.